fear inside.
My name is Daniel Carter, and what I'm about to tell you is the reason I never drive alone at night anymore. It happened during a trip through Montana when I was driving toward a small town called Red Lodge. I'd been on the road for almost 6 hours. It was past midnight, the highway was almost completely empty, and my phone had lost signal hours earlier. I wasn't worried at first. I had enough fuel, my GPS was working, and I knew I only had another couple of hours to go. Then I saw a road sign in my headlights. Last exit, 3 miles. I remember that sign very clearly because there was a bullet hole through the letter E. I passed it and kept driving. About 20 minutes later, I saw the exact same sign again. Same words, same bullet hole, same crooked metal post. I slowed down and stared at it. I thought maybe I had somehow turned onto another road without realizing it. My GPS showed that I was still going in the right direction. I kept driving. A few minutes later, another sign appeared. Last exit, 3 miles. This time I knew something was wrong. I pulled over and checked the map. The blue line on the GPS was moving, but the road around me wasn't changing. I was almost ready to turn around when I noticed a small gas station through the trees. One yellow light flickered above the building. I decided to stop. Maybe someone there could tell me where I was. I parked beside an old fuel pump and walked toward the entrance. An old man was standing outside. He looked at me without saying anything. I asked him if the station was open. He shook his head. "You shouldn't have taken this exit," he said. I laughed nervously and asked him why. He pointed behind me, "Because nobody comes back from that road." I looked toward my car for a second. When I turned around again, the man was gone. There was no door opening, no sound of footsteps, nothing. I walked closer to the building and looked through the glass. The shelves were covered in dust. Old newspapers were lying on the floor. Behind the counter was a calendar dated October 1998. I stepped backward. That's when my phone suddenly vibrated. I had no signal, but somehow a message had arrived from an unknown number. It said, "Don't look in the back seat." I froze. My car was parked less than 20 feet away. I didn't want to look directly at it, so I stared at its reflection in the gas station window. At first, I saw only my car. Then I saw something sitting behind the driver's seat. A person, a dark figure with its head lowered. I ran back to my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't look into the back seat. I drove away as fast as I could. After about 10 minutes, I finally looked at the rear-view mirror. The back seat was empty. I almost cried with relief. Then the radio turned on by itself. Static filled the car. A woman's voice whispered through the speakers. "You left me there." I switched the radio off. It turned back on. "You left me there." I pulled over and checked the back seat. Nothing. I checked the trunk. Nothing. I started driving again. Then my GPS spoke. "You have arrived at your destination." I looked at the screen. My stomach dropped. The destination was the same abandoned gas station. I threw the phone onto the passenger seat and kept driving. The highway suddenly became darker. No signs, no houses, no other vehicles. Then I saw headlights behind me. A car was following me. I sped up. It sped up too. I slowed down. It slowed down. Finally, the car pulled beside me. I looked over. There was nobody inside. The driver's seat was empty, yet the car continued moving beside me. I panicked and slammed the brakes. The empty car disappeared into the darkness. I kept driving until I saw the first town sign, Red Lodge, 18 miles. I thought I was safe. But when I checked the clock, only 3 minutes had passed since I left the gas station. I'd been driving for almost an hour. I reached the town just before sunrise and stopped at the first open diner. I told the waitress everything. She became silent when I mentioned the gas station. "There hasn't been a gas station there for decades," she said. I showed her the photograph I had taken through the window. She looked at it and immediately called someone. Later, a local police officer told me the station had burned down in 1998. 3 people had died that night. One of them was a night attendant who had been standing outside when the fire started. The officer asked me if I had spoken to an old man. I nodded. He showed me an old newspaper photograph. It was the same man I had seen at the station. He had died in the fire. I still have the photograph from that night. But there is something I never told the police. When I look closely at the picture, the old man isn't standing alone anymore. Someone is standing behind him. It's me. And every few months, the photograph changes slightly. The last time I checked, the figure behind me was standing much closer. I tried throwing the photograph away several times, but it always came back. Once, I burned it in a metal sink and watched the paper turn completely black. The next morning, it was sitting on my kitchen table, perfectly clean. Another time, I locked it inside a box and left the box at a storage facility. 3 days later, the box was sitting outside my apartment door. I stopped keeping the picture inside my home after that. I gave it to a friend who collects old photographs. He called me 2 weeks later and asked why I had sent him a photograph of himself. I told him I hadn't. He sent me a picture of the photograph. The old gas station was still there. The old man was still standing outside, and I was still behind him. But my friend was now standing beside me. That's when I realized whatever was connected to that road wasn't following me anymore. It was collecting people. A year later, I drove through Montana again during the daytime with 2 friends. I wanted to prove to myself that the gas station didn't exist. We followed the same highway. There was no gas station, no exit, nothing. But 3 miles ahead, we saw a road sign. Last exit, 3 miles. My friend laughed and said it was probably an old sign. I didn't answer. As we passed it, I looked in the side mirror. For just 1 second, I saw the old man standing beside the road. This time, he wasn't looking at me. He was pointing at my friend's car door. My friend suddenly screamed. He said someone had knocked 3 times from inside the trunk. We stopped the car, but the trunk was empty. We never found out what made those sounds. I only know one thing. Since that day, I never take an unknown exit after midnight, and if I ever see a sign with a bullet hole through the letter E, I turn around immediately. Because some roads don't lead somewhere. Some roads are waiting for someone to take them. My name is Emily Parker, and I used to believe that the worst thing that could happen during a road trip was getting a flat tire in the middle of nowhere. I don't believe that anymore. This happened in Oregon during a rainy October night. I was driving alone from a small coastal town toward Portland. I had planned to reach the city before sunrise, but heavy rain slowed me down. The highway was almost completely empty. Fog covered the road and my headlights barely reached beyond the next few yards. Around 2:42 in the morning, I saw someone standing beside the highway. It was a man holding an old suitcase. He was wearing a dark jacket and his hair was completely soaked by the rain. I normally never pick up strangers, especially at night. But something about him made me stop. I lowered the window slightly. "Do you need a ride?" I asked. The man nodded. "Just to the next town." His voice was quiet. I unlocked the passenger door. He got inside and placed the suitcase between his feet. I noticed something strange immediately. His clothes were completely wet, but there wasn't a single drop of water on my passenger seat. I tried not to think about it. I asked his name. "Thomas," he said. I asked where he was going. He looked through the windshield and whispered, "Home." I smiled awkwardly. "Where is home?" He pointed toward the road, mile 42. I had no idea what that meant. We drove in silence for several minutes. Then I noticed he was holding an old photograph. I asked if it was his family. He nodded. They've been waiting for me. I looked at the photograph. It showed Thomas standing beside an old car with a woman and a little boy. Something about the photograph looked old, almost like it had been taken decades earlier. "Are they still alive?" I asked. Thomas slowly turned toward me. "No." I stopped asking questions. The rain became heavier. At exactly 2:58 a.m., we passed a road marker showing mile 42. Thomas suddenly said, "Stop here." I pulled onto the shoulder. He opened the door and stepped outside with his suitcase. Before closing the door, he looked directly at me. "Thank you for bringing me home." Then he disappeared into the fog. I waited for a few seconds before driving away. 10 minutes later, I noticed something on the passenger seat. The old photograph. I picked it up and turned it over. Written on the back were the words, "Thomas Reed, missing since October 17, 1986. My hands started shaking. I searched for a place to pull over. When my phone finally got a signal, I searched his name online. The first result was an old newspaper article. Thomas Reed had disappeared on that exact highway in 1986. His car had been found near mile 42. His body had never been recovered. I stared at the photograph again. There was something different about it. The woman and the boy were still there, but Thomas was looking directly at me. I threw the photograph onto the floor. Then my phone buzzed. A message appeared from an unknown number. "You picked him up." I didn't know what to do. Another message arrived. "Now he knows where you live." I immediately drove to a motel and locked myself inside a room. I didn't sleep that night. At around 4 a.m., someone knocked on my door. 3 slow knocks. I looked through the peephole. Nobody was there. Then a man's voice whispered, "Emily." I froze. I had never told Thomas my name. The voice whispered again, "You brought me home." I stayed silent until sunrise. The next morning, I went to the police and showed them the photograph. An officer recognized the road and told me something that made me feel sick. Mile 42 had been the location of several unexplained disappearances over the years. Every victim had reportedly seen a man carrying an old suitcase before disappearing. I asked why nobody had closed the road. The officer looked at me and said, "Because we don't know where the road goes after midnight." I left Oregon that same day. I never drove that highway again. Months later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was the same photograph I had thrown away. But it had changed. Thomas was still standing beside his family. I was standing beside him now. And in the background was my car. On the back of the photograph, a new sentence had appeared. "Next time, don't leave me at mile 42. I burned the photograph that night. At least I thought I did. 3 weeks later, I found it inside my car. After that, strange things started happening around my apartment. Every night at 2:42 a.m., I heard a car door close outside my building. At first, I thought it was a neighbor. Then one night, I looked through the window. There was an old, dark-colored car parked across the street. The headlights were off. Nobody was sitting inside. I watched it for almost 10 minutes. Then the passenger door slowly opened. Nobody stepped out. It simply opened and stayed there. The next morning, the car was gone. I told myself I had imagined it. A few days later, I received another unknown message. It contained only a photograph. It showed me sleeping in my apartment. I dropped my phone. I immediately called the police, but they couldn't find anyone. They told me to change my locks and install cameras. I did both. The camera recorded nothing unusual for several weeks. Then one night, the footage showed something impossible. At 2:42 a.m., My front door opened by itself. A man carrying an old suitcase walked inside. He stood in the hallway for almost 30 seconds. Then he turned toward the camera. His face was Thomas's. The footage ended there. I moved out the next day. I never learned where Thomas wanted to go, but about 6 months later I received one final message. It said, "I'm home now." Under the message was a photograph of a small house. I recognized it immediately. It was my childhood home, the same house where my parents still lived. I called my mother. She answered normally. I asked if anyone had come to the house that night. She said no. Then she paused. "Emily, why are you asking?" I told her about Thomas. She became silent. Finally, she said something I had never heard before. "Your father used to talk about a man named Thomas." My blood went cold. My mother said that when I was very young, my father had picked up a stranger on a highway. The man had been carrying a suitcase. He told my father he was going home. My father never told anyone what happened after that night. I finally understood. Thomas had been doing this for decades. He wasn't looking for a town. He wasn't looking for a house. He was looking for drivers willing to take him home. And once you gave him a ride, he never completely left your life. My name is Michael Reed, and I have stayed in hundreds of hotels because of my job. Most rooms are forgettable. Some are uncomfortable. A few are strange. But there is one room I will never forget, even though I still don't understand whether it actually existed. It happened during a business trip through Nevada. I had been driving all day and didn't want to continue through the desert at night, so I stopped at an old roadside hotel. It was almost midnight. The building looked abandoned from the outside, but one yellow light was glowing above the entrance. I walked inside. An elderly woman was sitting behind the reception desk. She looked at me as if she had been expecting me. I asked if she had a room available. She reached under the desk and pulled out an old brass key. The number on it was 214. "Second floor," she said. I took the key. Before I left, she grabbed my wrist. "If someone knocks after 3 a.m., don't open the door." I smiled and asked if that was some kind of hotel rule. She stared at me. "No, it's a warning." I went upstairs. The hallway was strangely long. I walked past several doors before finding room 214. I unlocked it and entered. The room looked ordinary. A bed, a table, an old lamp, and a television. But there was one strange thing. There was no window. I checked the bathroom, locked the door, and went to sleep. At exactly 3:07 a.m., I woke up to 3 knocks. Knock, knock, knock. I immediately remembered the woman's warning. I stayed completely still. Another 3 knocks came. Then a woman's voice whispered, "Michael." My entire body went cold. I had never told the receptionist my name. "Michael, please open the door." I didn't answer. The voice became softer. "I know you're awake." I pulled the blanket over myself and waited. After a few minutes, I heard footsteps moving away. I didn't sleep again. At sunrise, I opened the door. The hallway was empty. I went downstairs and confronted the receptionist. "Someone was knocking on my door last night." She looked frightened. "Which room?" I said. 214. She dropped the cup she was holding. "That's impossible." She opened a large register and showed me the hotel's floor plan. There were rooms 201 through 213, then 215. There was no 214. I laughed nervously and told her I had slept there. She shook her head. "Room 214 burned down 20 years ago." I asked what happened. She said a woman had been staying there when the fire started. She died before anyone could reach her. "Her name?" I asked. The receptionist looked at me. "Emily Reed." My heart stopped. That was my mother's name. My mother had died when I was a child. I had never told the receptionist that. I asked how she knew. She didn't answer. I ran upstairs. The hallway looked different. I counted the doors. 201, 202, 203. I kept walking. 213, then 214. The door was there again. I opened it. The room was exactly the same, but this time there was a photograph on the table. It was a picture of my mother. I recognized it immediately. She was standing outside the same hotel. On the back was a date, November 12, 2004. I looked at the bed. There was a suitcase lying on it. My name was written on the tag. Suddenly, the bathroom door opened by itself. I heard a woman's voice behind me. "Michael, you came back." I ran out of the room. The hallway seemed endless. I kept running until I reached the stairs. I rushed downstairs and found the receptionist crying behind the desk. "You saw her," she whispered. I asked who. She pointed upstairs. "Your mother." I couldn't speak. She told me that 20 years earlier, a young boy had stayed at the hotel with his mother. The boy's name was Michael. The woman had died in the fire, but the boy had survived. I stared at her. "That's impossible. I wasn't here." She shook her head. "Not this year." I looked at the clock. It was still 3:07 a.m. Somehow I had been upstairs for hours, but only seconds had passed downstairs. I ran outside and drove away. I never stopped until I reached Las Vegas. Later I searched for the hotel online. There was no record of it, no address, no photographs, nothing. But the strangest part happened months later. I was cleaning an old box belonging to my mother when I found a photograph. It showed the same hotel entrance. Standing beside the door was my mother. Beside her was a little boy. Me. And above the entrance was a room number I had never seen before, 214. Written on the back were 5 words: "He will come back someday." I haven't stayed in a hotel alone since that night. But every year on November 12th, exactly at 3:07 a.m., someone knocks 3 times on my bedroom door. And every time a woman's voice whispers my name. I eventually moved to another state and stopped talking about the hotel. I changed my phone number, deleted the photographs, and even threw away everything that belonged to my mother that reminded me of that night. For almost 2 years, nothing happened. I started believing that maybe the whole thing had been some kind of nightmare caused by exhaustion. Then I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a hotel receipt. The date was November 12, 2004. The guest name was Michael Reed. Room 214. I stared at it for several minutes. I had been born in 1997. I couldn't possibly have stayed there in 2004. I called the hotel number printed on the receipt. A woman answered. I asked if the hotel still existed. There was a long silence. Then she said, "It hasn't existed since 2004. I asked who she was. She replied, "The night receptionist." I dropped the phone. The same elderly woman from the hotel had answered me. That night, I couldn't sleep. At 3:07 a.m., 3 knocks came from my bedroom door. Knock, knock, knock. I stayed in bed. Then my mother's voice whispered from the hallway, "Michael, you forgot something." I didn't move. The voice came again. "You left your suitcase." I looked toward the door. Underneath it, I saw a shadow. Someone was standing outside. I called the police, but before they arrived, the shadow disappeared. When I opened the door, there was nothing there, except an old brass key lying on the floor. The number was 214. I threw it into a river the next morning. 2 days later, it appeared on my desk. Since then, I have kept it locked inside a safe. I never touch it. I never look at it. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of a hotel hallway outside my bedroom, a distant elevator bell, slow footsteps, and then 3 knocks. I know what happens if I open the door. I know what is waiting outside, so I never open it. But there is one thing that scares me more than the knocking. Sometimes, when I look at the bottom of my bedroom door, I can see a thin line of light from the other side, and I know that there is no hallway there. There is only my wall.
Thank you for watching Fear Inside.